What if I told you that Rome didn't fall because of its enemies, but because it was split in half by its own leaders? A world superpower, fractured not in a single moment but over decades. Not by barbarians but by emperors. Not by weakness but by the weight of its own ambition. Why did one empire become two? Why did one half vanish, while the other survived for nearly 1,000 more years? Was it geography? Politics? Betrayal? Or something deeper? Something in Rome's very DNA? This is the story of an empire too large to rule, too proud to adapt, and too divided to survive. Welcome to Why Rome Was Split in Two. Before we go deeper into the unraveling of an empire, a quick word to those joining us for the first time. Welcome. Thank you for choosing to spend your time here. If you're curious about the forgotten corners of history and the stories most people miss, you're in the right place. To those already subscribed, you know how far we're willing to go to bring the past back to life. And to our new viewers, if you find yourself drawn in, consider subscribing. There's so much more ahead, and I'd be honored to share it with you. The empire called itself one, but even its stones told another story. In Rome, laws were inscribed in Latin, rigid and declarative. In Aftershocks, laws were etched in Greek, framed like philosophical essays. Across the empire, the message was the same: unity. But the language was never one. The empire's borders were not just drawn on maps, they were carved into the land itself. In the west, rivers defined fate. The Danube and the Rhine acted not just as frontiers, but as blindfolds. Beyond them lay forests, bogs, and shifting tribal alliances. Rome's control here was never more than partial. In Britain, whole generations lived and died without seeing a Roman senator. The legions came. The legions left. The empire's presence was skeletal. In contrast, the East did not need Rome to build cities. They had been cities long before Rome's republic even had aqueducts. The Hellenistic world, an inheritance from Alexander, meant that urban networks, libraries, academies, and syncretic religion already flourished in places like Pergamon and Antioch. These cities had their own traditions of administration and diplomacy. The Romans simply slotted themselves in, sometimes respected, sometimes resented, often tolerated. And where the West bled for grain, the East shipped it. Egypt fed the empire. The Nile, predictable and bountiful, provided Rome with a regular harvest, until it didn't. Control of Egypt wasn't just economic, it was existential. Augustus had seized it not as a province, but as his personal domain, guarded jealously from senatorial interference. Why? Because if Egypt rebelled, Rome starved. But Rome wasn't the only hungry city. In the West, frontier provinces like Hispania and Britannia rarely received enough imperial aid to stabilize their economies. Roads existed, yes, but many were built for extraction, not integration. The taxes left. The benefits did not return. Cities in Gaul and northern Italy began issuing local coinage decades before the West's collapse. Not because of innovation, but desperation. Of the things that are of use to life, the East provides nearly all. The West consumes what it cannot create. An empire of unequal lungs, one side gasping, the other holding its breath. But what happens when the strong side no longer wants to carry the weak? The empire still called itself indivisible. But inside its boundaries, something older was returning. Something Rome had buried, but never truly erased. Rome was still intact on the maps. The roads still stretched from Britannia to Syria, the legions still marched, and the imperial seal still stamped every letter from the capital. But inside, the empire was losing something it couldn't reclaim: its grip on identity. An identity once lost is the first step toward fracture. By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome's sense of control was more performative than practical. The veneer of central authority masked growing independence on the ground, especially in the western provinces. Though senators in Rome still debated grain taxes and frontier reports, their decisions increasingly failed to reach, or resonate with, the provincial populations they claimed to rule. In Roman Britain, for example, the presence of Rome had always been thinner than the rest of the empire. Cities like Londinium and Eboracum were constructed with Roman materials and governed by imperial edicts, but most of the countryside remained organized under native hierarchies. Latin inscriptions appear to decline rapidly by the early 5th century, and what's more telling is what replaced them: locally etched memorials in Celtic dialects, burial styles that reverted to pre-Roman customs, and shrines to gods like Nodens and Coventina, who had never been fully erased by Roman religion. This wasn't simply neglect, it was reassertion. Across much of Britannia and Hispania, Rome's retreat was welcomed in rural areas that had never truly Romanized. The people had not forgotten who they were before the eagle banners arrived. They had only buried it. Now, those tribal memories were returning village by village. In Gaul, the aristocracy remained Roman in dress and speech, but even there, cracks formed in the empire's social logic. Wealthy landowners, who had once funded public works as iurgitai, benefactors, began to hoard rather than give. This ancient social contract had held Roman civic life together. You gained prestige not by what you kept, but by what you gave to your city. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, granaries, and even festivals were privately funded in exchange for honor and status. But when the future looked uncertain, and when tax burdens grew unbearable, the elite stopped building, and started fortifying. And so cities, once public realms of imperial pride, became increasingly private fortresses. Records from Trier and Arlate reveal estate walls built not to mark land but to defend it. Civilians stopped attending public baths. Instead, they clustered around bishops and military men for protection. The empire, for centuries a stage of shared performance, now fragmented into anxious enclaves. Meanwhile, the eastern provinces, often idealized in contrast, faced their own unraveling. While Alexandria and Antioch remained imperial jewels, large parts of Syria and the Arabian frontier were only partially integrated. Aramaic-speaking communities, Nabatean traders, and nomadic Arab tribes moved across imperial borders with limited interference. Many paid taxes to Rome but lived under their own elders, followed their own deities, and buried their dead in traditional ways. Some bore Roman citizenship, but few considered themselves Roman. This duality defined the late empire: people who lived in it but not for it. Then came the most dangerous shift of all, the transformation of the military. Rome's legions, once manned by citizens of the Italian heartland, became increasingly filled by men from the peripheries: Illyrians, Thracians, Syrians, and Germans. The empire no longer raised soldiers from loyalty, it bought them. The rise of foederati, foreign warrior groups granted land inside the empire in exchange for service, was not a sign of strength, but desperation. In 376 CE, the Roman government permitted a large number of Goths to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory, ostensibly as allies. These were not refugees. They were warriors, families, and entire societies fleeing the pressure of the Huns. Roman administrators, hoping to control and tax them, failed catastrophically. Food supplies were mismanaged, extortion followed, and soon the Goths rebelled. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, Emperor Valens marched east with a Roman army and was defeated, and killed, by the very Gothic forces he had tried to absorb. It was not merely a military defeat, it was psychological. A Roman emperor had died in battle against those living under his own rule, inside his own empire. The illusion of Roman superiority collapsed that day. Neither the sun nor the stars brought aid that day, for the emperor fell among the dust of his broken legions, and with him, the dignity of Rome. This was not an invasion from the outside. It was failure from within. The empire had opened its gates, not in friendship, but in fear. It needed soldiers and it thought it could control them. It could not. What made this moment even more destabilizing was what followed. Instead of restoring order, the Gothic federates were allowed to remain in place, armed, semi-autonomous, and under their own leaders. Rome had not only lost the battle, it had acknowledged the beginning of parallel sovereignties inside its own borders. The West, with its weaker cities and overstretched legions, felt the fracture first. But the East watched closely. Some whispered that it was time for each half of the empire to go its own way, while others feared what dividing might unleash. The center still held, for now. The emperor still ruled. The roads were still patrolled. The laws were still written in Latin. But the loyalty was fading. The language was fragmenting. The rhythm of Rome no longer beat in time across its own lands. The question wasn't whether the empire could last. That was already slipping. The question was, who would be the first to act? The empire was still breathing, but it wasn't stable. It was surviving. And for nearly 50 years, survival was all Rome could manage. The crisis of the 3rd century wasn't just a period of instability, it was the empire's nervous breakdown. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome witnessed the rise and fall of 26 emperors. Most ruled for less than 3 years. Some never made it to Rome. Others died without ever securing the loyalty of the eastern or western provinces. Loyalty had become regional, ambition local. The real fracture began in 235 CE when Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own troops on the German frontier. Sin? Negotiating with the enemy. In that moment, the authority of the emperor ceased to be sacred. It became expendable. The legions declared their own commanders as emperors. But so did governors. Even city councils began minting their own coins and erecting their own defenses. The empire didn't collapse under a single usurper. It shattered under 100 would-be emperors. By 260 CE, Rome had fractured geographically. The Gallic Empire broke off in the west, centered around Trier and Cologne. In the east, Palmyra declared its own sovereignty under Queen Zenobia. But here's the truth textbooks often gloss over. These weren't just power grabs, they were local solutions to imperial absence. Palmyra's control over caravan routes kept trade flowing eastward. The Gallic Empire maintained order in provinces abandoned by central authority. Rome had stopped being an empire of loyalty. It had become an empire of necessity. The governors began to govern not by decree but by default. For Rome sent no grain, no gold, and no answers. Even as order was occasionally restored by men like Aurelian, who reconquered both Gallic and Palmyrene territories, the core issue remained. Power now came from the provinces. The Senate, increasingly ceremonial, watched from afar. And all the while, another disease spread, not a plague of bodies but of coin. We often speak of Rome's currency as collapsing under inflation, but that tells only half the story. The deeper issue was confidence. When emperors debased the silver content of the denarius, they weren't just corrupting coin, they were undermining credibility. By 260 CE, some coins bore silver traces so faint they turned green in rainwater. The treasury minted faster than markets could adjust. People responded the only way they could. They stopped using money altogether. In places like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, papyrus records reveal merchants refusing imperial coinage outright. Instead, they demanded payment in wheat, cloth, or livestock. In parts of Syria, temples began functioning as secure banks, not because of religious revival, but because their granaries were safer than Roman currency. The economy didn't just collapse. It decentralized, shifting toward barter, regional credit systems, and trust-based local exchanges. Another subtle shift went unnoticed by many: the militarization of commerce. Soldiers were still paid, often first and in full, while civilians waited. Armies began creating mobile economic zones around their encampments. Market towns sprouted near fortresses, but vanished once legions moved. Economic life began to orbit the military, not the cities. Roman civic institutions, basilicas, bathhouses, councils, fell into disuse not because of barbarian threat but because they no longer mattered. Let it not be an imperial coin, for it holds no value. Bring instead the measure of wheat or the skins agreed upon. In the year 284 CE, the legions of the East gathered to proclaim a new emperor. He was not from Rome, not from the Senate, not even from an aristocratic province. He was Diocletian, a child of the Balkan coast, the son of a freedman or a scribe. Sources conflict, but all agree. He was born far from power. His ascent was not inevitable. Diocletian had risen through the cavalry ranks in a military system that no longer favored bloodlines, but survival. His first act as emperor was ruthless and symbolic. When the previous emperor Numerian was found dead in a litter under suspicious conditions, Diocletian executed the man accused of concealing the death, Aper, in front of the troops. Some said he struck him down with a sword. Others suggest the story was shaped to craft an image. Justice served quickly and absolutely. Whether true or theatrical, it worked. The army followed him. But Diocletian understood something no emperor before him had dared to admit publicly. The empire as it existed could not be saved. It had to be redesigned. And to do that, he would need to not only rule, he would need to redefine what it meant to be Roman. He had no imperial ancestors, no Senate base, no Roman pedigree. But what he had was vision and ruthlessness. Next, Diocletian restructures power, not to heal the empire but to divide it by design. It wasn't enough to fight Rome's enemies. Diocletian knew the real threat came from within: ambition, distance, disloyalty. So he rebuilt the army. But that was only the beginning. Rome's traditional military identity, disciplined, citizen-soldier-based, deeply Roman, was already a relic by the late 3rd century. Diocletian didn't attempt to revive it. He replaced it with a bifurcated force: stationary border troops, limitanii, and centralized rapid response field armies, comitatenses. This was not just strategic adaptation. It was an admission. Rome was no longer a single battlefield. Previously, Roman forces were deployed primarily along the limes, the fortified borders that lined the Danube, Rhine, and eastern deserts. But the repeated incursions of the 3rd century had exposed the system's fragility. Rome had fortifications, but lacked reaction time. So Diocletian's reforms restructured the empire into military zones where governors, now called duces, were often also generals. This marked a fundamental shift in civil-military relations. Local military control began to supersede traditional senatorial administration. What's often forgotten is that this wasn't just a logistical change, it was cultural. Troops settled permanently along the frontier. Veterans received land nearby. Their children often followed them into the ranks. These areas became garrison societies, where Roman and local identities fused. Over time, frontier zones developed accents, customs, and gods that were only partially Roman. This militarized lifestyle bred loyalty, not to Rome but to local commanders and regions. Diocletian's military reforms held the borders, but at the cost of diluting the empire's cultural core. Let those on the river remain armed. They are the shield of empire and must be as immovable as the banks they guard. And while the soldiers were reorganized, so too was the state. Because one man could no longer govern the empire. Diocletian wouldn't try to. He would divide it and call it peace. In 293 CE, Diocletian formalized what the crisis of the 3rd century had already made clear. The empire needed more than one ruler. The Tetrarchy, or rule of 4, was his solution. 2 Augusti, senior emperors, and 2 Caesars, junior heirs, each overseeing a quarter of the empire. Diocletian positioned himself in Nicomedia, overseeing the eastern half, while Maximian governed the west from Mediolanum. Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, each deeply loyal, each from the Balkan military elite, were installed as their junior partners. But the physical separation of these rulers was no small detail. Each governed a distinct territory with its own court, army, and imperial staff. Each minted its own coins, issued its own laws, and styled its own imperial iconography. Though they referred to each other as brothers, they ruled separately. What's rarely acknowledged is that the Tetrarchy operated more like a shared cult than a joint government. Each emperor associated himself with a patron deity. Diocletian with Jupiter, king of the gods, Maximian with Hercules, the demigod protector. Their coinage, once generic, now bore these divine pairings. Imperial portraits shifted from lifelike busts to stiff, symbolic icons with enormous eyes and identical poses. Unity was not reflected in shared policy, but in shared theater. Genio Populi Romani, not the genius of the emperor but of the Roman people. A shift from ruler to system, from man to myth. The empire had become an ideological machine, reinforced by image, ritual, and military authority. The Tetrarchy didn't just divide rule, it changed what rule looked like. But no system survives ambition. And Diocletian's genius was also his gamble. For rulers, but only one legacy. The most radical element of the Tetrarchy wasn't the division of land. It was the control of succession. Each Augustus would retire, elevating his Caesar, creating a repeatable, stable transfer of power. Diocletian envisioned emperorship as a role to serve, not seize. He even retired voluntarily in 305 CE, retreating to his palace in Spilt and famously growing cabbages while the empire held its breath. But succession was never just about planning. It was about legitimacy. And that's where Diocletian's system cracked. When Constantius Chlorus died in 306 CE, his son Constantine was declared emperor by the army in York. He was not the chosen Caesar, he was not approved by the system. But he had the troops. And in Rome, Maxentius, son of Maximian, declared himself emperor too, enraged at being passed over. The Tetrarchy had tried to eliminate dynastic ambition by excluding sons. Instead, it inflamed it. The sons of emperors, Constantine, Maxentius, later Licinius, rejected the artificial design. They didn't want roles. They wanted thrones. Galerius, the only remaining senior Augustus, tried to hold the center by promoting allies and downgrading threats, but it was too late. By 310 CE, the empire had 6 rival emperors, each with their own court, coinage, and army. What the Tetrarchy named order became the multiplication of crowns. Diocletian's retirement had removed the architect, but left the scaffolding. No one knew how to hold it together without him. The Tetrarchy wasn't a cure, it was a pause. And now the storm was returning. The empire had been divided to save it. But division, once introduced, became the language of power. And it would echo for centuries. Next, Constantine's march from the provinces to supremacy, and the moment the empire finds a new capital in the east. Rome was still the empire's soul. But it no longer housed its mind, or its fists. By the end of the 3rd century, the word Rome no longer meant just a city. It meant an idea, an identity. But power had already begun to move with the emperor, and increasingly the emperor was no longer in Rome. Trier, perched on the edge of the Moselle, once a quiet frontier town, became the primary residence of Constantius Chlorus and later Constantine. Trier's strategic location allowed the Western Emperor to monitor both the Rhine and the rebellious heart of Gaul. But Trier was not simply a convenient camp, it was transformed into an imperial city. With its palladium, basilicas, and the enormous Alla Palatina, it physically declared that power now lived among the provinces, not above them. And in doing so, it shifted the imperial gaze away from the Italian peninsula. In the Italian north, Milan, or Mediolanum, had already eclipsed Rome in military significance. With direct access to Alpine roads and supply routes, it allowed Maximian and later Constantine to respond rapidly to any threat from the north. But the symbolism was profound. This was an emperor's seat inside Italy, but outside Rome. The Roman aristocracy, still rooted in the capital, felt the insult. Even official visitors from the Senate had to travel to provincial cities to be heard. One could still earn titles in Rome, but decisions were made elsewhere. The eastern seat, Nicomedia, was chosen with ruthless calculation. Diocletian placed his imperial residence not in Antioch or Alexandria, traditional eastern hubs, but on the Bosphorus rim. This was a message. Nicomedia offered proximity to the Persian frontier, but more than that, it sat at the cultural seam between Rome and Asia, Latin and Greek. Here, Diocletian could govern eastern provinces while reshaping imperial imagery. In Nicomedia, he built not only palaces and forums but a new kind of court, rigid, ritualized, quasi-divine. Power in the east began to be cloaked in mystery, in sacred language, and in Greek administrative norms that would echo long into the Byzantine future. Here in Bithynia, the emperor is more god than man, more priest than judge. Rome commands. Nicomedia sanctifies. Crucially, these were not capitals as in our modern sense. They were nodes, imperial headquarters that moved with campaigns, with tax assessments, with shifting threats. In some cases, such as Sirmium in the Balkans or Thessalonica, a military emperor might hold court for only a year or two, but that city would be transformed nonetheless. The bureaucracy followed the body of the emperor, and the cities that hosted him became temporarily sacred. this shift of power eastward was not just practical, it was psychological. The West had temples, the East now had palaces. Rome had ancestry, the East had immediacy. And in Nicomedia, under Diocletian's reforming eye, the empire became something new, not a state ruled by one man, but a structure controlled by four. It was brilliant. It was unprecedented. It was the Tetrarchy. Diocletian believed he had fixed the system. 4 emperors, 4 regions, shared authority, institutional succession. A Rome no longer ruled by rivalry but by design. But in crafting his masterpiece, he failed to confront a truth older than the empire itself. No Roman ever truly wanted to share power. The illusion of unity was meticulously constructed. Coins showed emperors side by side. Ceremonies were mirrored across cities. Decrees bore collective names. But underneath, each emperor ruled his own army, his own bureaucracy, and in time, his own destiny. The Augusti still held seniority, but their Caesars began to amass loyalty of their own, especially Galerius in the Balkans and Constantius in Gaul. These junior rulers were not content to wait. They were building courts, distributing favors, raising sons. And succession, Diocletian's crowning innovation, was its weakest point. In 305, when Diocletian and Maximian retired simultaneously, the Tetrarchy seemed to function. Galerius and Constantius became Augusti, and 2 new Caesars were appointed. But within a year, Constantius died, and his son, Constantine, bypassed the system entirely. Declared emperor by his father's troops in York, Constantine invoked blood, not bureaucracy. And he would not be the last. Maxentius, son of Maximian, followed suit in Rome. The empire was designed for loyalty, but sons remembered lineage. Where there were to be heirs, there rose instead claimants. Where there was to be a cycle, there came a circle of knives. The Tetrarchy worked only so long as Diocletian breathed. Without him, the system's architecture was dismantled by ambition and memory. The East and West had different emperors, different languages, different problems. They also had different visions for what Rome should become. And though the coinage still bore the faces of 4 emperors, behind them, the shadows had begun to sharpen. The empire had been split to save it. But in trying to stop the next civil war, Diocletian had only delayed it. Next, the sons of emperors, the ambition of soldiers, and the rise of Constantine, Rome's last unifier, and the founder of its other half. Rome tried to divide power to save itself. But all it did was teach its heirs how to claim more of it. Diocletian's Tetrarchy was an experiment in balance, designed to share power across space and time. But empires built on balance don't die in collapse. They die in succession. In 306 CE, when Constantius Chlorus died in Britain, the soldiers under his command immediately proclaimed his son, Constantine, as emperor. This was not part of the plan. Constantine had not been chosen by Diocletian's structure, but the structure was already creaking. Galerius, the senior Augustus in the East, tried to enforce succession by appointing Severus, not Constantine. Yet Galerius underestimated how far imperial legitimacy had shifted, from the logic of order to the loyalty of troops. Meanwhile, in Rome, Maxentius, son of retired Emperor Maximian, staged his own coup. By October 306, he declared himself emperor, seizing the capital and reviving the old Senate's influence. Ironically, Maxentius claimed to restore Rome, styling himself as Conservator Urbis Sui, the preserver of his city, a direct jab at Diocletian's neglect of the Eternal City. Rome had 6 emperors, Constantine in Gaul, Maxentius in Rome, Galerius and Maximinus in the east, Severus in Italy, briefly, and Licinius rising in the Balkans. Maxentius, guardian of the ancient gods, restorer of liberty, beloved by the Senate and the people. Civil war was not an aberration. It had become the default mechanism of Roman succession. Between 307 and 312, shifting alliances, betrayals, and political marriages blurred every faction. Constantine's sister married Licinius. Maximian defected to Constantine, then tried to betray him. Severus was executed. Galerius died of a painful illness, and in his absence, Maximinus Dea and Licinius carved up the east. No emperor ruled the whole, and no emperor ruled without war. But one figure, steady and ambitious, began to outlast them all: Constantine, the silent tactician of Gaul. Constantine's early reign was marked not by grand vision but by deliberate consolidation. His campaigns on the Rhine and in Britain weren't just military victories, they were strategic lessons. He secured grain routes, built alliances with tribal federates, and most importantly, he ensured his troops were paid, often by seizing enemy treasuries after every confrontation. When he turned his sights on Maxentius in 312, Constantine moved with precision. His march from Gaul was no lightning charge. It was methodical. He secured northern Italy, winning over cities like Turin and Verona with calculated clemency. He didn't loot or burn, he incorporated. His victories were military and symbolic. The climax came at the Milvian Bridge. Eusebius would later record a miraculous vision, a cross of light in the sky with the words in hoc signo vinces. But earlier sources, including Zosimus, are silent. The truth may be more grounded. Constantine had already been using the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god, on his coinage. The Christian Chiro may have been a strategic rebranding, one that unified his troops, many of whom were already sympathetic to Christianity. Coins dated post-Milvian Bridge still depict Sol, not Christ. Maxentius, meanwhile, was politically isolated. Though he held Rome and claimed to defend tradition, his relations with the Senate and Praetorian Guard had frayed. He tried to invoke Augustan nostalgia, but Constantine outmaneuvered him with new ideology and better logistics. At the Milvian Bridge, Maxentius was forced to fight, overconfident in his sacred omens. He drowned in the Tiber as his troops fled behind collapsing fortifications. Constantine entered Rome not as conqueror, but as liberator and master of the Western Empire. But Licinius remained. By 313, the two emperors met at Milan, not to war but to negotiate peace. Constantine married his half-sister to Licinius. Together they issued a joint decree, not an edict, as later tradition calls it, but a letter of toleration, affirming the rights of Christians and all others to practice their religion freely. It was both an act of pragmatism and a weapon against Eastern rivals, especially Maximinus Dea, who still persecuted Christians. But was Constantine's cross truly divine, or a political banner chosen with purpose? Constantine's conversion is among the most dissected moments in Western history. His supporters, led by Eusebius of Caesarea, portray him as divinely chosen, a new Moses. His critics, then and now, see opportunism, a shrewd emperor aligning himself with the fastest-growing, most resilient ideology in the empire. At the time of his so-called conversion, Constantine had not been baptized, nor did he immediately abandon pagan rituals. In fact, he continued to mint coins with Sol Invictus. He retained the title Pontifex Maximus, head of the traditional Roman cult. The shift was gradual, carefully navigated. In a fractured empire, Christianity offered something no other cult could: centralization. A moral code, a shared script, and bishops who could help govern populations. But his relationship with Christianity was not passive. Constantine reshaped the church to serve imperial needs. He convened the Council of Alls, 314, and later the Council of Nicaea, 325. Not just to clarify doctrine, but to end division within the church, which he saw as a threat to unity. He favored the Orthodox, suppressed Donatists, and later exiled Arians, though he would restore some of them as politics required. It was Constantine who judged not only the heretics, but the bishops who failed to make peace. The conversion of Constantine was not just religious, it was imperial theology. He was fashioning a new image of authority, not as divine but as ordained by God. The emperor was no longer just the guardian of Roman tradition. He was the protector of Christian unity. It gave him moral legitimacy, a new foundation for dynastic power, and a direct hand in the affairs of the soul. Constantine had won the empire. Now he would remake it, not from Rome but from a new vision. He conquered in Rome's name. But Constantine's empire would not live in Rome. Before Constantine ever set foot on the Bosphorus, the sight of Byzantium had already drawn imperial eyes. Septimius Severus, a century earlier, had crushed its rebellion and, impressed by its location, rebuilt it. Sitting at the hinge between Europe and Asia, Byzantium controlled not just the Bosphorus Strait, but the junction of imperial priorities: trade from the Black Sea, grain from Egypt, and armies from the Balkans. When Constantine refounded the city in 324 CE, he wasn't starting from scratch, he was reclaiming a forgotten blueprint. The region offered natural defenses: steep hills, deep harbors, and walls already built by nature. But its real power was metaphysical. It lay east of Rome but not beyond the Roman imagination. The emperor could raise a new capital, untouched by the Senate's ghosts or the weight of pagan rituals, while keeping the aura of Romanitas intact. He named it Nova Roma, but the people called it Constantinopolis, Constantine's city. He summoned artisans from every corner of the empire, emptied temples of their gods and statues, and filled this new Rome with the art of the old. The transfer wasn't just architectural, it was administrative. Though some imperial departments remained in Nicomedia and Antioch, Constantinople received a Praetorian prefecture, a senate, and a grain supply system, custom-built to mimic the old Rome. Constantine adorned it with spolia from across the empire: porphyry columns from Heliopolis, statues from Athens, and a massive bronze serpent from Delphi, placed in the hippodrome. The message was clear: this was Rome's legacy rebuilt, not in memory but in motion. But Constantine didn't just bring stone and silver. He brought ideology, and a church ready to govern alongside him. In this new capital, faith would no longer be passive. It would become infrastructure. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't a footnote in theological history, it was the birth of imperial Christianity. Convened not by bishops but by the emperor himself, it marked a turning point, where the state no longer persecuted Christianity but sought to define it. Constantine housed the bishops in his imperial palace and presided like a priest-emperor, not interested in mystery but in uniformity. He needed a church that could unify, not fracture. But that unity proved elusive. In the years following Nicaea, Arian sympathizers, Donatists, and Novatianists all claimed legitimacy. Constantine exiled bishops one year, restored them the next. His policies were inconsistent, but always aimed at preventing regional loyalty from outpacing doctrinal control. And Constantinople was his tool. Here, imperial Christianity became legal, institutional, and increasingly Greek. The city housed synods, canon law scribes, and later councils that would establish it as the second see of Christendom, right behind Rome. It was here in the new capital that bishops no longer feared emperors, but served beside them as co-authors of order. And it was more than religious. By the late 4th century, emperors like Theodosius I would declare Christianity the only legal religion, and Constantinople would begin building an administrative network of bishops, monasteries, and schools that served both faith and empire. Rome had popes. Constantinople had power structures. And all the while Rome, the eternal city, remained. But only in form. By 330 CE Rome was still grand, still proud, still full of temples and senators. But the emperor no longer lived there. He no longer legislated from the curia or judged from the forum. Rome had become a stage, not a seat. Constantine visited it only once after his victory over Maxentius, and never returned. In contrast, Constantinople absorbed the machinery of rule. Its Senate, modeled after the Roman original, gave the Eastern aristocracy access to imperial proximity. Its port, the Golden Horn, soon rivaled Alexandria's in grain throughput. Its military command centers linked directly to the Eastern legions, particularly those stationed in the Danube corridor, the empire's most critical defense line. Even as the West struggled with Vandal raids and Germanic migrations, Constantinople was being encircled with walls that would withstand siege after siege. Rome's elite noticed. Some moved east to stay close to imperial patronage. Others remained, clinging to dignity but increasingly isolated. The Bishop of Rome, however, would rise, slowly and strategically, as the city's true political figurehead. In the absence of emperors, the bishop became Rome's voice to the Christian world, but with less administrative power than his counterpart in the East. Rome was still called the capital, but it was a city without an empire, while Constantinople was an empire with a city newly built to hold it. By the end of the 4th century, Constantinople had fully eclipsed its predecessor. It had the army, the church, the treasury, the court, and most critically, it had the emperor's shadow. Rome was still eternal, but Constantinople was now inevitable. It was the most organized the empire had ever been. It was also the most brittle. When Constantine streamlined the Roman administration, he wasn't just chasing efficiency, he was chasing survival. The empire had nearly collapsed during the crisis of the 3rd century. Now, every coin, tax, and soldier had to be accounted for. His solution was an empire not of cities, but of offices. Rome's imperial machine became divided not only by region, but by function. Civil governors lost their military command. Military officers, the duces, no longer handled tax collection. Justice, logistics, grain, and currency were now the realm of separate departments, all reporting vertically, bypassing local traditions. It was brilliant, but it was suffocating. One missed shipment of tax in kind, and a village could vanish from the record. The curiales, once proud city magistrates, were now conscripted tax agents. Many abandoned their posts, fled to the countryside, or became clerics just to escape obligation. This decay of the municipal class, the civic soul of Rome, was not the result of barbarians or plague, but bureaucratic suffocation. Let no one born of a curial father escape the duties owed to the city, even under holy orders. The bureaucracy had become a net, and the empire's strength depended on keeping people in place, not letting them move. Power had a new address. The ancient senatorial class of Rome, long the gatekeepers of tradition, now faced a choice: become decorative or become migratory. Some remained in Rome, clinging to rituals, restoring temples, and funding games that no emperor attended. But many others adapted. They relocated to Constantinople, Antioch, or even provincial capitals like Carthage and Thessalonica, where imperial favor still flowed. There they shifted roles, from lawmakers to landlords, from speakers to silent backers of regional generals. And even in Constantinople, Latin held on. The city's law codes, imperial titles, and court rituals still used the old tongue, at least for now. Greek would dominate the streets and sermons, but the state remained bilingual for decades, slowly tilting toward the language of the East. The Latin tongue remains on tablets and lips alike, but the habits of the East seep into our bones. What we often miss is that this wasn't just a linguistic shift. It was a psychological migration. Latin-speaking aristocrats, watching the imperial center move, began to lose faith in universal rule. Local loyalty, regional security, and tribal alliances began to fill the vacuum. Constantine's genius lay not in restoring the empire, but in redefining it. The unity he imposed was not a return to Augustus, it was a reinvention. He fused military success, Christian legitimacy, and imperial ritual into a new mythology of power. His coins bore the labarum, his statues mixed Christian gestures with solar halos. He was a bridge, not between pagan and Christian, but between ancient flexibility and modern centralization. He was no longer first among equals, but God's chosen ruler on earth. But such unity came at a cost. By institutionalizing the church, he politicized faith. By favoring Constantinople, he alienated the West. By fixing the structure, he froze its flaws. The world Constantine left behind had the appearance of wholeness, but underneath, it was filled with pressure points. East versus West, center versus province, church versus bishop. He was the empire's architect, but not its heir. What he built, others would only inherit in parts. The empire had survived, but only because it had stiffened. And when stiff things break, they shatter. The empire had survived the 3rd century through reinvention. But reinvention has a price. And that bill was coming due. Next, the Western world crumbles, while the East watches. It wasn't just Rome that was falling, it was the very idea that Rome could last forever. By the late 4th century, much of the Western Empire had become a paradox, still called Roman but barely functioning like Rome. In the rural stretches of Gaul and Hispania, statues still stood in forums, but weeds had overtaken them. Municipal buildings were silent. The empire's letters took weeks longer to arrive, if at all. The cursus publicus, Rome's once efficient imperial postal system, had withered from lack of funding and secure roads. When messages stopped flowing, governance followed. Meanwhile, taxation shifted from gold to goods in kind, a desperate response to a debased currency and a shriveling urban economy. The annuona militaris, the grain tax for troops, was enforced not through civil means, but often at sword point by soldiers who became tax collectors. Those with wealth fled inland. The rest stayed, silenced by poverty and disconnected from a capital that increasingly treated them like a burden, not a citizenry. One Gothic chieftain reportedly told a Roman ambassador, "You ask us to pay like Romans, but you defend us like strangers. Those who deny the tax shall be bound to the land until death delivers them." This led to the proto-feudalization of the West. Local magnates who could feed and defend were obeyed. Civic authority collapsed into patronage. Rome no longer ruled, it was tolerated as long as it didn't ask too much. In some Gallic towns, Christian bishops became de facto governors, because they were the only figures left with literacy, money, and ties to Constantinople. And then came those Rome had once invited. They came not to destroy, but to stay. The Visigoths had once been allies. In 376, they begged Rome for shelter across the Danube to escape the Huns. Valens agreed, but only in name. What followed was exploitation. Corrupt Roman officials traded dog meat for Gothic children. Starvation turned allies into insurgents. What's often missed is how organized the Goths were, with command hierarchies, discipline, and scouts embedded in Roman lands years before the rebellion. The Vandals and Suebi, unlike the Visigoths, entered the western provinces by crossing the Rhine in 406 AD, on foot through ice. It was not a military invasion but a mass migration of entire peoples. Elderly, livestock, children, pressed forward by desperation. Roman troops stationed in Britain and Gaul either stood down or defected. A large part of the Roman army in the west by then was composed of foederati, many of whom had more loyalty to their commanders than to Rome itself. And then there were the Franks, who never invaded in the traditional sense. They were already in Roman lands, settled along the Rhine and often recruited into legions. But over time their chieftains became local warlords. By the late 5th century, Franks weren't tearing down the empire, they were replacing it from inside. When Clovis became king, he didn't abolish Roman law. He adopted it, surrounded by Roman bishops and advisors. Better to serve the barbarians who feed us, than Rome who forgets us. These weren't invaders. They were competitors for legitimacy. And in many cases they won, not through battles but through administration. And then came the blow Rome could not imagine, the day her own strategy imploded on itself. The East thought it could contain the Gothic pressure with politics. Valens believed he could secure a quick victory and earn personal glory. But on August 9, 378, outside Adrianople, Gothic cavalry poured through Roman lines in a surprise flank maneuver, while the Roman heavy infantry, locked in a tight formation under blistering heat, could barely breathe. The emperor was lost, possibly incinerated with his staff in a farmhouse. Others were hunted down for miles. But what's less known is that Adrianople was fought in silence. No Roman reinforcements came from the west. Gratian, the Western Augustus, was delayed by Alemanni incursions. And after the battle, the Eastern Empire made no move to avenge Valens. They negotiated with the Visigoths, allowing them to settle semi-autonomously within the empire. Adrianople didn't just kill an emperor. It killed the myth that Rome's legions, no matter how battered, would always prevail. It killed the confidence of border communities. It cemented a precedent. Barbarians could no longer be beaten, they had to be bargained with. Rome's courage had been wounded beyond repair. After Adrianople, it fought only for delay. And the Eastern Empire, calculated, cautious, watched. It would not fall. Not yet. But it would also not save the West. Rome's legions still wore the eagle, but they no longer carried its soul. The transformation of the Roman army into a composite force of foreign recruits is often told as a story of decline, but in truth, It began as a strategy of survival. By the late 4th century, the empire could no longer draw enough native-born citizens to staff its borders. So it adapted. It offered land, gold, and rank to federated tribes in exchange for military support. These were not ragtag mercenaries. They were organized groups with internal discipline and long-standing grievances. Some, like the Franks and Alemanni, were gradually absorbed into Roman service and even stationed across Gaul. Others, like the Goths, entered through Treaty Foedus, which granted them territory and semi-autonomy. But the danger was always latent. These were forces Rome did not fully control. In 402 AD, the Vandal-descended general Stilicho, Rome's last great western general, defended Italy from Alaric's Visigoths and even planned to resettle the Goths in Illyricum. He saw federation as the empire's salvation. Yet Stilicho, for all his loyalty, was not trusted. He was foreign-born and in a paranoid court that was fatal. In 408 he was executed, along with thousands of his federati families. Rome had not just killed its best general, it had shattered its own alliance structure. The soldiers, learning their children and wives had been slaughtered, marched away weeping, not to desert but to remember. The message to the federati was clear: you will never be one of us. The consequence was swift and catastrophic. They had asked for land and dignity. Rome answered with blood. The Visigoths' sack of Rome in 410 AD did not begin with a siege. It began with negotiation. Alaric had tried repeatedly to reach an agreement with Honorius. He wanted what all foederates wanted: a home inside the empire, a title, recognition. He had even supported the idea of setting up Priscus Attalus as a puppet emperor who might grant him those things. But the Roman court refused. To them, Alaric was still an outsider. When the gates of Rome finally opened, not by force but by starving slaves within the city, Alaric made a show of restraint. His Goths entered with discipline. Churches were spared, women were protected under command, and the looting was, by Roman standards, targeted. This was not vengeance. It was ritual humiliation. Alaric was not destroying Rome. He was reminding Rome it had destroyed itself. They left the temples untouched, yet took the gold from those who called themselves divine. After the sack, Alaric marched south, intending to sail to Africa, the empire's breadbasket. But storms destroyed his fleet. He died weeks later, buried secretly in the bed of a river, with slaves slaughtered to protect the site. To this day his grave remains hidden. A king who stormed Rome, then vanished into the earth. The city still stood, but what it stood for no longer existed. While the Visigoths marched through Italy across the sea in Britain, the empire simply stopped speaking. For generations, Britain had been defended by the legions. It had walls, roads, tax offices, and churches. But by 410 AD, troops had been siphoned off to fight wars in Gaul and Italy. Imperial funds dried up. And then silence. The so-called rescript of Honorius, cited by Zosimus, told the cities to defend themselves. Many assumed this meant Britain, but the phrasing is ambiguous. Some scholars now argue it referred to Bruttium, a southern Italian province also under threat. If so, the idea that Rome officially abandoned Britain is more legend than law. Yet the result was the same. Britain fractured. Roman villas were reused as strongholds. Latin faded from everyday speech. Wroxeter, one of the last Romanized cities, adapted and thrived briefly, but it was a flicker. By the 430s, Saxon mercenaries invited to defend the coasts were seizing lands. Rome hadn't left Britain. It had just forgotten to return. Bathhouses remained in use decades after the legions left, heated by charcoal, cleaned by hands who no longer knew Latin. In cultural memory, Rome remained a golden age. But in the fields, in the forests, and in the crumbling forums, a post-Roman reality was already taking root. And while cities turned to silence and generals faded into myth, new powers were rising, claiming to rule not after Rome but instead of it. Rome still had emperors, but none who knew how to rule. After the sack of Rome, the West was not yet dead, but it had become hollow. The imperial court drifted between Ravenna, Milan, and Arles, while power fell to generals with private armies and foreign blood. Honorius was followed by Valentinian III, who reigned for 30 years but rarely led. His mother, Galla Placidia, daughter of Theodosius I, acted as regent, and for a while kept the empire from breaking. But once she was gone, the rot returned. Valentinian's empire was largely held together by Flavius Aetius, the last truly competent general in the West, sometimes called the last of the Romans. He defeated Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, with the help of Visigothic allies. But success bred fear. In 454, Valentinian murdered Aetius with his own hands. The court once again chose paranoia over survival. The following year, Valentinian himself was assassinated by Aetius' former guards. The empire had become a hall of mirrors, one where assassins whispered louder than senators. We are ruled not by emperors but by those who feed them their thoughts. After this, emperors came and went in a blur. Petronius Maximus ruled for just 77 days. Avitus, a puppet of the Visigoths, was mocked in Rome for his Gallic accent. And finally, Romulus Augustulus, a teenager installed by his father, ruled in name while the Germanic general Orestes commanded in fact. When Orestes was killed by Odoacer, a soldier of probable Syrian descent, no one resisted. But there's something few tell you. Romulus Augustulus wasn't even recognized by the East. The Eastern Emperor Zeno still considered Julius Nepos, exiled in Dalmatia, to be the true Western ruler. Romulus was a fiction, a placeholder. In 476, when Odoacer deposed him and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, it was less a coup than a reality check. The title of emperor wasn't stolen. It was returned, like armor no longer worn. The Eastern Roman Empire watched the West unravel not with horror, but with strategy. Initially it offered help. In the early 400s, Eastern forces aided in battles across Italy and Gaul. Constantinople sent gold, fleets, and legates to prop up the fragile Western court. But the costs were immense, and the return uncertain. By the mid-5th century the East changed course. The emperors began to recognize barbarian rulers like Odoacer as legitimate governors of Italy, so long as they acknowledged the emperor's symbolic primacy. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Let others rule while we retain the name of Rome. This wasn't passive decline, it was careful pruning. Zeno had no desire to waste men and money defending a West that could no longer fund itself. He saw what the Senate did not. Rome's form might live on longer if it were broken apart. If you govern Italy justly, we shall regard you not as conqueror, but as guardian. And yet, Constantinople's cultural divergence from the West widened. In the East, Greek replaced Latin in administration. Theology, not law, became the organizing principle of society. Emperors debated Christ's nature at councils. In the West, cities like Trier, Arles, and Milan fell into obscurity. Aqueducts dried up. Schools shuttered. Senators converted to Christianity but abandoned the classics. The West didn't just lose territory. It lost what it meant to be Roman. There was no single moment when Rome ended. No clear line. No funeral. The poet Rutilius Nemesianus, writing in the early 5th century, still praised Rome's resilience. But by 480, letters from Gaul, Spain, and Britain refer to kings rather than emperors. Local bishops, not governors, resolved disputes. Coins were stamped not with imperial portraits, but with the faces of tribal kings who barely spoke Latin. The barbarians are better than us, for they fear their gods while we defile ours. It wasn't just that the West fell. It was that it forgot how to stand. Rome's institutions hollowed out. Its stories faded. Its books were left untranscribed. And its people, once citizens of the most powerful empire on earth, became subjects, then serfs, then strangers in their own history. What died was not Rome's body. It was its name, its memory, its map in the mind. Long after emperors stopped mattering, bishops began to rule. But not over land, over meaning. As imperial banners were lowered in the western provinces, something else rose, not a kingdom of swords but of words. And its capital was not Ravenna or Milan, but the bishop's seat in Rome. With no emperors left to assert divine order, the Western Church stepped into the vacuum. But what it built wasn't just spiritual. It was institutional, ritualized, and, most importantly, exclusive. The Bishop of Rome, invoking the apostolic authority of St. Peter, declared not just primacy, but infallible custody of the true faith. But this purity was in many ways the result of decline. As Roman education collapsed in Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, fewer bishops could even read Greek, much less debate in it. The West's theology became narrower, yes, but also more unified by necessity. This rigidity became a feature, not a flaw. Heresies like Pelagianism, which denied original sin, and Donatism, which questioned the sacraments of impure priests, were violently stamped out not because they were new, but because the papacy needed clarity to claim legitimacy. By the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great would call himself Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. Yet under that humble title, he dispatched missionaries across Germania and Britain, compiled liturgical texts, and exercised more control than any Western ruler had in decades. Gregory wasn't just the head of the Church, he was the last Roman administrator in the West, issuing orders, collecting taxes, and even commanding militias in a crumbling Italian countryside. In the ashes of empire, he planted the idea of a spiritual Rome, and it would endure longer than the Caesars. But unity in the West came at the price of memory. In the East, memory bred conflict, and conflict bred identity. Unlike the shrinking West, the Eastern Roman Empire had the manpower, bureaucracy, and language diversity to debate God in public. And debate they did, ferociously, endlessly, and often violently. The first great heresy, Arianism, found fertile ground not among scholars but soldiers. While bishops in Constantinople argued the ousia of Christ, Gothic mercenaries and generals adopted Arianism through early missionary efforts like Wulfila's Gothic Bible, written in the 4th century. By the 5th, the bizarre irony was clear. The defenders of the imperial frontiers were doctrinal heretics, loyal in arms but alien in faith. Further east, disputes grew sharper. Nestorius, Patriarch of Constantinople in the early 5th century, rejected the term Theotokos, God-bearer, for the Virgin Mary. To him, It confused the divine and human natures of Christ. This wasn't a minor quibble. It ignited a war of councils, Ephesus in 431, Chalcedon in 451, and saw churches literally torn apart by angry mobs. Nestorianism was exiled eastward, where it flourished from Mesopotamia to China. The Assyrian Church of the East, heirs to Nestorian theology, would outlive the Roman Empire itself, sending missionaries to Tang China as late as the 8th century. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cyril fought Nestorius tooth and nail, not for theology alone but for influence. Cyril's brand of Miaphysitism, which saw Christ's divine and human natures fused into one, became the cornerstone of Egyptian and Armenian Christianity. But Constantinople rejected it. The result? Egypt, Armenia, and Syria never truly accepted Byzantine control again. These provinces were religiously alienated decades before they were conquered by Islam. And when the Arabs arrived in the 7th century, many Miaphysites welcomed them as relief from Chalcedonian oppression. The Byzantines came to take our souls. The Arabs only asked for gold. Orthodoxy was not universal. It was weaponized. The theological chaos had another side: institutional rivalry. For centuries, 5 patriarchates held sway over Christendom: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. But only one claimed to speak for Peter himself, and only one sat next to the emperor. The Bishop of Constantinople had no apostolic lineage. What he had was imperial proximity. Beginning with the Council of 381, Constantinople was called New Rome, and its bishop given second place. But Rome never forgot the phrasing: second in honor, not in power. As Constantinople's patriarchs grew bolder, intervening in disputes across Illyricum and issuing edicts to distant churches, Rome pushed back. One forgotten flashpoint was Illyricum, a borderland between East and West. For decades, popes and patriarchs competed for jurisdiction there, issuing rival bishops and conflicting orders. But this wasn't about theology, it was about map control. Whoever governed the faith in Illyricum could claim spiritual authority over Balkan lands once loyal to the old Roman West. By the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I tried to impose a single Orthodox faith across East and West. He reconquered Italy, restored Roman law, and imprisoned popes who resisted his theological dictates. It backfired. When the dust settled, Constantinople had reclaimed land, but lost moral trust. The papacy became more alienated and assertive, increasingly claiming that its authority came from God, not emperors. Rome was no longer an empire, but it had found something even more enduring: the right to define what was true. The split in Rome was not a sword slice. It was a slow severing of meaning, across pulpits, law courts, and painted ceilings. Power was no longer shared. It was translated, and lost in translation. Long after emperors stopped mattering, bishops began to rule. But not over land, over meaning. As imperial banners were lowered in the western provinces, something else rose, not a kingdom of swords but of words. And its capital was not Ravenna or Milan, but the bishop's seat in Rome. With no emperors left to assert divine order, the Western Church stepped into the vacuum. But what it built wasn't just spiritual. It was institutional, ritualized, and, most importantly, exclusive. The Bishop of Rome, invoking the apostolic authority of St. Peter, declared not just primacy, but infallible custody of the true faith. But this purity was in many ways the result of decline. As Roman education collapsed in Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, fewer bishops could even read Greek, much less debate in it. The West theology became narrower, yes, but also more unified by necessity. This rigidity became a feature, not a flaw. Heresies like Pelagianism, which denied original sin, and Donatism, which questioned the sacraments of impure priests, were violently stamped out not because they were new, but because the papacy needed clarity to claim legitimacy. By the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great would call himself Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. Yet under that humble title, he dispatched missionaries across Germania and Britain, compiled liturgical texts, and exercised more control than any Western ruler had in decades. Gregory wasn't just the head of the Church, he was the last Roman administrator in the West, issuing orders, collecting taxes, and even commanding militias in a crumbling Italian countryside. In the ashes of empire, he planted the idea of a spiritual Rome, and it would endure longer than the Caesars. But unity in the West came at the price of memory. In the East, memory bred conflict, and conflict bred identity. Unlike the shrinking West, the Eastern Roman Empire had the manpower, bureaucracy, and language diversity to debate God in public. And debate they did, ferociously, endlessly, and often violently. The first great heresy, Arianism, found fertile ground not among scholars but soldiers. While bishops in Constantinople argued the ousia of Christ, Gothic mercenaries and generals adopted Arianism through early missionary efforts like Wulfila's Gothic Bible, written in the 4th century. By the 5th, the bizarre irony was clear. The defenders of the imperial frontiers were doctrinal heretics, loyal in arms but alien in faith. Further east, disputes grew sharper. Nestorius, Patriarch of Constantinople in the early 5th century, rejected the term Theotokos, God-bearer, for the Virgin Mary. To him, it confused the divine and human natures of Christ. This wasn't a minor quibble. It ignited a war of councils, Ephesus in 431, Chalcedon in 451, and saw churches literally torn apart by angry mobs. Nestorianism was exiled eastward, where it flourished from Mesopotamia to China. The Assyrian Church of the East, heirs to Nestorian theology, would outlive the Roman Empire itself, sending missionaries to Tang China as late as the 8th century. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cyril fought Nestorius tooth and nail, not for theology alone but for influence. Cyril's brand of Miaphysitism, which saw Christ's divine and human natures fused into one, became the cornerstone of Egyptian and Armenian Christianity. But Constantinople rejected it. The result? Egypt, Armenia, and Syria never truly accepted Byzantine control again. These provinces were religiously alienated decades before they were conquered by Islam. And when the Arabs arrived in the 7th century, many Miaphysites welcomed them as relief from Chalcedonian oppression. The Byzantines came to take our souls. The Arabs only asked for gold. Orthodoxy was not universal. It was weaponized. The theological chaos had another side: institutional rivalry. For centuries, 5 patriarchates held sway over Christendom: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. But only one claimed to speak for Peter himself, and only one sat next to the emperor. The Bishop of Constantinople had no apostolic lineage. What he had was imperial proximity. Beginning with the Council of 381, Constantinople was called New Rome, and its bishop given second place. But Rome never forgot the phrasing: second in honor, not in power. As Constantinople's patriarchs grew bolder, intervening in disputes across Illyricum and issuing edicts to distant churches, Rome pushed back. One forgotten flashpoint was Illyricum, a borderland between East and West. For decades, popes and patriarchs competed for jurisdiction there, issuing rival bishops and conflicting orders. But this wasn't about theology, it was about map control. Whoever governed the faith in Illyricum could claim spiritual authority over Balkan lands once loyal to the old Roman West. By the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I tried to impose a single Orthodox faith across East and West. He reconquered Italy, restored Roman law, and imprisoned popes who resisted his theological dictates. It backfired. When the dust settled, Constantinople had reclaimed land, but lost moral trust. The papacy became more alienated and assertive, increasingly claiming that its authority came from God, not emperors. Rome was no longer an empire, but it had found something even more enduring, the right to define what was true. The split in Rome was not a sword slice. It was a slow severing of meaning, across pulpits, law courts, and painted ceilings. Power was no longer shared. It was translated, and lost in translation. In the crumbling West, Rome became not a city of emperors but of bishops. The papacy's claim to power wasn't immediate, it was carved slowly, often painfully, out of necessity and absence. Popes in the 6th and 7th centuries were appointed by the Byzantine emperors. But by the 8th century, Constantinople's long reach faltered. Plagues, Arab invasions, and iconoclasm distracted the East. When Pope Gregory II rejected Emperor Leo III's orders to destroy icons, it was more than rebellion, it was a declaration of autonomy. Yet papal independence was a patchwork fiction. Popes were still subject to Roman aristocratic clans, the militia of the Lateran Palace, and most of all, Frankish kings. The so-called donation of Constantine, a forged 8th century decree used by the papacy to justify rule over Western Christendom, was one of the most influential hoaxes in medieval history. Its very success tells us something crucial. The Church had to invent Roman continuity because political Rome no longer existed. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the emperor stood as both defender and legislator of the faith. This wasn't tyrannical arrogance, it was continuity. Ever since Constantine presided at Nicaea, Byzantine rulers had understood theology as a form of governance. Justinian didn't just build Hagia Sophia. He summoned councils, exiled bishops, and defined doctrine. Yet this power was not absolute. Patriarchs like John Chrysostom were exiled for condemning imperial excess. Centuries later, Patriarch Michael Cerularius would lock churches that followed Latin rites, provoking the 1054 schism. So much for Caesaropapism. In practice, it was a theocratic tension, not a unity. But even theology can fracture on the edge of a word, especially when that word cannot be read on both sides of the empire. In 400 AD, any Roman citizen, whether in Britain or Bithynia, could likely follow a legal decree in Latin. By 800, that shared tongue was dead in the East and dying in the West. Theologians in Constantinople debated the divine nature of Christ in classical Greek, while Western bishops spoke a Latin already mutating into early Italian, French, and Spanish. The break wasn't just in pronunciation, it was in meaning. The East developed nuanced metaphysical language using Platonic and Aristotelian terms. The West, increasingly pastoral and legalistic, focused on ritual and sin. A great example of this failure to communicate lies in the Filioque clause. The Latin addition, and the Son, to the Nicene Creed enraged Greek theologians, not just because of its theology, but because it was unilaterally inserted without ecumenical approval. Worse, many Eastern clergy read the term through a faulty Greek translation that implied two sources of divinity, something bordering on heresy. The effects were structural. As fewer texts were translated between East and West, shared theological vocabulary collapsed. The same word, like ousia, essence, meant subtly different things across the divide. This wasn't just a religious problem, it was diplomatic chaos. Treaties, councils, and theological correspondences became bogged down by mutual incomprehension. By the 9th century, Western missionaries like Cyril and Methodius were sent to Slavic lands using new alphabets, not Greek or Latin, but Glagolitic and later Cyrillic, signs that both churches were now building distinct cultural worlds. And what those words built soon turned into stone and paint and law. In Constantinople, art was revelation. Not depiction but participation in the divine. Mosaics shimmered like the heavens. Gold leaf backdrops eliminated earthly perspective, as if saints floated in light unmade by human hands. Icons were not decoration. They were portals, visual theology. But in the West, especially after Charlemagne, art turned historical. Realistic crucifixions. Narrative cycles. Mary holding Jesus like a grieving mother, not an enthroned queen. This aesthetic divergence reflected deeper legal and political realities. The East codified. Under Justinian, the Corpus Juris Civilis created a Byzantine legal standard that would last 1,000 years. His texts weren't just laws, they were theological documents, declaring that imperial justice reflected divine order. The West, meanwhile, lost legal coherence. Barbarian law codes, Lex Salica of the Franks, Lex Visigothrum, Lex Alamanorum, governed civil life, while only canon law retained pan-European influence. In effect, the Roman Church became the only surviving transnational legal institution in the West. Art, law, language, and ritual now moved in opposite directions. Western churches began building in Romanesque stone, thick walls, Latin crosses, eternal judgment. Eastern churches expanded the domed basilica, representing heaven on earth. Even angels looked different. The Wests were humanized warriors. The Easts were ethereal beings of flame. So the same faith built two empires of the mind. And only one could still call itself Rome. In an empire now ruled by bishops, Julian stood alone, draped not in purple but in Plato. He would be the last Roman emperor to kneel at an altar of Zeus. When Theodosius died in 395, his empire was still whole, but his sons would not be. Theodosius the Great was many things, a soldier, a theologian, and a master of statecraft, but above all he was the final Roman to rule an empire that stretched unbroken from the Scottish highlands to the Persian frontier. His rule was forged in crisis. After the devastating Roman defeat at Adrianople, it was Theodosius who reorganized the Eastern army, implemented federate treaties with the Goths, and stabilized a collapsing world. But he also locked in a dangerous precedent, allowing foreign peoples to live under their own kings within imperial borders. Theodosius didn't merely tolerate Nicene Christianity, he weaponized it. The Codex Theodosianus was not just law, it was imperial theology. Pagan sacrifice became treasonous, heretical bishops were exiled, and Nicene orthodoxy became the state's ideological scaffolding. But even as he outlawed public rituals to Jupiter and closed the famed temple of Serapis in Alexandria, he simultaneously allowed Gothic Arianism to flourish among his federate allies. The empire wasn't religiously unified, it was doctrinally partitioned, even as it called itself Catholic. Libanius, a pagan rhetorician in Antioch, called Theodosius the hammer of temples, lamenting not only the closures but the transformation of the emperor into a religious enforcer rather than a civic father. Upon his death, Theodosius left his two sons as heirs, Arcadius, 18, in Constantinople, and Honorius, a child of 10, in Milan. While the West would soon stumble into chaos, the East underwent its own transformation, not of territory but of governance. Arcadius was shy, soft-spoken, and politically passive, but his court was anything but docile. It became a crucible for the imperial model that would define Byzantium. Ministers who ruled from behind the throne, eunuchs like Eutropius, and bishops like John Chrysostom, who tried to assert moral authority over imperial power. Constantinople in Arcadius's time saw some of the fiercest religious street riots in the Roman world. Clashes between Nicenes and Arians, monks and imperial guards, senators and bishops. These weren't just theological debates. They were proxy wars over who spoke for the soul of the East. Arcadius, too timid to intervene, let others wield imperial tools in his name. But this chaos created institutional resilience. The bureaucracy learned to function even without a strong ruler. Meanwhile in the West, Honorius became emperor in name, but the man pulling the strings was Stilicho, a general of half-Vandal descent married into the Theodosian dynasty. Stilicho ruled from Ravenna, not Rome, and his use of Germanic troops and diplomatic marriages reveals the changing face of the empire. Roman identity was already stretching, bending, accommodating. And yet, despite their differences, both empires continued to refer to themselves as one state, a fantasy that papered over growing structural divergence. Arcadius and Honorius issued joint laws for nearly a decade, but court delays and different enforcement standards meant some laws were effectively dead on arrival in the other half. 2 capitals, 2 armies, 2 languages emerging. But still they called it one Rome. Rome had ruled the world. Now it couldn't even rule itself. Its emperors fled, its legions fractured, and in the empty marble halls of once mighty forums, only echoes remained. When Honorius relocated the western imperial seat to Ravenna in 402, it was framed as a military precaution. But this act did more than protect the emperor. It symbolized the withdrawal of the state from the soul of the empire. Ravenna was surrounded by marshes, protected by natural defenses and the sea, and closely tied by trade routes to the Eastern Empire. In many ways, it resembled Constantinople more than Rome, a calculated resemblance. But this physical move came at a psychological cost. Rome became ceremonial, a ghost of republican grandeur. The Senate still met, but its authority was ornamental. Honorius, isolated in Ravenna, was increasingly removed from the political, economic, and military realities facing the West. His court was small, defensive, and reactionary. What little central authority remained was often directed at suppressing internal revolts rather than external threats. Cassiodorus later described Ravenna as a city where East and West converse, hinting at its role as a geopolitical halfway point, but also a place where decisions were delayed by the murky bureaucracy. And as the emperor hid, the Visigoths remembered. Alaric, a former comes in Roman service and a trained commander under Theodosius, was no mere barbarian. He understood Roman law, Roman custom, and Roman pride. His siege of Rome was not an act of savagery, it was a political message. He sought recognition for his people as legitimate federates. What he received instead was empty promises and broken treaties. When Alaric entered Rome in 410, he did so with restraint. Churches were spared. Sacred artifacts were respected. But the symbolism of the act cut deeper than any sword. For the first time since the Gauls in 390 BCE, Rome was in enemy hands. The shock reverberated through the Mediterranean world. Saint Jerome, far away in Bethlehem, wrote, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" But what truly died in 410 was not the city, but the myth of invincibility. Some Roman senators negotiated privately with Alaric for preferential treatment. The sack wasn't just external, it exposed the internal divisions of a Rome willing to bargain with its own invader. But the real blow wasn't to the empire's heart. It was to its stomach. In 439, Carthage fell to the Vandals without a battle. Geiseric's forces walked into the city, reportedly due to betrayal by pro-Vandal Roman soldiers inside. Carthage wasn't just a city, it was the financial backbone of the West. Its port handled taxes, trade, and grain. When Geiseric took it, he seized not only administrative offices but a fully functioning Roman infrastructure, including warehouses, minting facilities, and shipyards. The West's grain supply collapsed overnight. But Geiseric didn't just hold Carthage. He transformed it into an imperial rival. He struck coins with his own image. He hired Roman engineers to expand his fleet. He signed treaties with Constantinople, on equal footing. While the West begged for support, the East cautiously recognized Geiseric's power. By the 430s, African dioceses contributed over 2/3 of the Western Empire's tax base. The loss of Africa wasn't just logistical, it was a fiscal death sentence. The West had no army to reclaim it, no ships to blockade it, and no emperor with the courage to face it. With its capital behind marshes, its grain in foreign hands, and its generals turning on one another, the Western Roman Empire still carried its name. But it no longer carried meaning. While the West unraveled, the East evolved. New laws, new rulers, and a language Rome never spoke. When the last Western emperor was deposed, there was no trumpet, no declaration, just a letter and a silence that changed everything. In the year 476 CE, something quietly seismic occurred. Odoacer, a commander of barbarian origin, likely of Syrian and Hunnic descent, marched into the city of Ravenna, not with rage but with precision. The reigning emperor Romulus Augustulus, a teenage puppet installed by his father Orestes, offered no resistance. He was deposed with almost surreal calm and granted a villa in Campania and a pension. But here's what history classes often skip. Odoacer never claimed the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, purple robe, diadem, scepter, back to Constantinople with a message: one emperor is enough. This act, recorded by the anonymous Valesianus and preserved in fragments, was not a confession of defeat. It was a shrewd political maneuver. Zeno, the Eastern Roman emperor, was cornered. Accepting Odoacer's claim would erase the Western throne. Rejecting it would risk open war. So he did something quietly brilliant. He didn't restore the Western Empire, but instead made Odoacer a patricius, a Romanized barbarian king ruling in Zeno's name, but under no illusions of imperial control. The Eastern emperor didn't wash his hands of the West. In fact, Zeno was already planning for something bigger. He would soon back Theodoric the Ostrogoth, sending him west to remove Odoacer in what became a state-sponsored transfer of power, not abandonment. The fall of Romulus Augustulus wasn't just symbolic. What truly collapsed was the Western imperial apparatus. The state machinery, provincial governors, tax collection, military conscription, ceased to function in any cohesive form. The Comes Sacrarum Largitionum, the treasurer of the empire, simply vanished in the West. Gold coinage diminished. Grain fleets from Africa, already severed by the Vandals in 439, had left Italy to starve for decades. After 476, no imperial laws were issued in Latin. The Codex Theodosius became a relic. Instead, barbarian rulers like Odoacer and Theodoric began issuing their own edicts and legal hybrids, half Roman, half tribal. Odoacer continued using Roman titles and governing with Roman legal customs, but the empire had become a mask worn by kings. What the Senate supported in their letters to Zeno was not the empire. They were endorsing survival, hoping that any order, even under a non-Roman general, was better than none. Rome did not fall in a day, but the Western Empire vanished in a generation. Zeno's decision to accept Odoacer's power grab was not negligence. It was strategic outsourcing. Within a decade, he sponsored the Ostrogothic King Theodoric, sending him west to reclaim Italy in the name of the empire. The logic was simple. Rome was not worth the blood of Greek-speaking Eastern troops, but it could still be managed through indirect rule. By backing Theodoric, Zeno preserved the illusion of imperial continuity without bearing its cost. This foreshadowed Byzantium's diplomatic genius for the next millennium: survival through proxy, prestige without overreach. The Vita Epiphanii records how Eastern officials later described Italy as the land of letters and saints, not arms, a cultural asset, but no longer a strategic one. This arrangement worked for a time, but it confirmed the final truth: there would be no restoration of the Western Empire. What remained was an idea, Romanitas, carried in law, language, and church. But the imperial machine was dead. When Zeno approved the death of the Western throne, he wasn't closing a chapter. He was opening a new one, an empire of bishops, icons, and empires born from ashes. After 476, no Roman emperor ever ruled from Rome again. Constantinople's emperors continued calling themselves Roman, and to many in the East they were. But the Latin-speaking West evolved along another path. The Church began to step into the imperial vacuum. Bishops became de facto rulers. Monasteries became centers of diplomacy and literacy. And in time, the Pope would rise to fill the silence left by emperors. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory I would write that Rome had fallen in body, not in soul, a claim that hints at what Rome became, not a capital but a spiritual inheritance. So when we say Rome fell, we miss the truth. Rome became two worlds, one Greek, imperial and enduring, the other Latin, fragmented and reborn through the church and feudal kings. But neither was ever again whole. But what happens when two Romes rise, one of emperors, the other of popes? One fluent in Greek, the other in canon law? When both claim the same inheritance, the stage is set for a slow, aching divorce. The empire split, but it didn't shatter. It evolved, out of necessity, ideology, and resilience. And what followed wasn't an ending but a metamorphosis. When the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer, no great battle was fought. There were no last stands, no Roman legions defending the Palatine Hill. The fall came silently, because Rome had already stopped being the center of power. The real surprise wasn't that the West fell, but that it had lasted as long as it did. Yet even in collapse, Rome lingered in form. In Italy, Odoacer didn't crown himself king of Rome. He became a patricius under the Eastern Emperor Zeno, maintaining the illusion of unity. In Gaul, Syagrius, son of Aegidius, ruled a so-called kingdom of the Romans from Soissons until Clovis crushed it. And in Britain, elites clung to villa estates long after Roman troops had vanished. A letter by Bishop Sidonius Apollinaris describes the 470s not as a time of apocalypse, but of unsettling hybridity, where Gallo-Roman aristocrats dined with Gothic warlords, while still quoting Virgil over wine. But tension simmered beneath the surface. When Theodoric the Great conquered Italy in the 490s, he tried not to replace Roman institutions but to hijack them. The Senate remained. Civil administration continued. Latin law was upheld. Yet Theodoric, a king who couldn't sign his name, was still Gothic, still Arian, and ultimately irreconcilable with the old Roman elite. His execution of Boethius, a philosopher who tried to bridge old and new, symbolized the death of consensus. Rome was now an idea in conflict. One man, one emperor, refused to let Rome be a memory. He would try to reclaim it all. His name was Justinian. Justinian, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled not with nostalgia but with obsession. His court was filled with classicists and code writers, generals and theologians. To him, restoring the West wasn't about glory, it was about reclaiming divine order. The Goths in Italy were heretics. The Vandals in Africa persecuted Nicene Christians. And the Western Church, adrift, needed imperial correction. His general Belisarius, schooled in maneuver warfare and political restraint, achieved miracles. He took Carthage in one battle. He stormed Rome with 7,000 men. But these victories were tenuous. Italy became a graveyard of cities. Rome changed hands 6 times during the Gothic Wars. Famine, plague, and siege reduced it to a shadow. Justinian won territory but lost the West's viability. The Byzantines under Justinian demanded oath-taking rituals from Western bishops, inserting imperial authority directly into theological hierarchy, a move that alienated many Latin clerics who had grown accustomed to autonomy. His codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was monumental. It preserved centuries of jurisprudence, some of which would resurface in Europe's universities a millennium later. But the empire's soul was shifting. The wars drained the treasury. The plague of Justinian, striking in 541, killed an estimated 25 to 50 million across the empire. The dream of reunion had been realized, but only briefly and at staggering cost. The West had collapsed under the weight of fragmentation. The East would endure by becoming something entirely new. By the 7th century, Constantinople was not merely a continuation of Rome, it was something else entirely. The government operated in Greek, the emperor presided over Orthodox councils, and military administration was conducted through the theme system, a decentralized system of provincial defense that outlasted even Charlemagne's empire. Theodosius's walls held back Persians, Huns, and Arabs. But internal threats tested the empire too. The iconoclast controversy, 726 to 843 CE, split the church between image worshippers and purifiers. The emperor no longer mediated between senate and people, but between heaven and heresy. Byzantium's legitimacy now flowed from the throne and the altar. Even in the 10th century, the Byzantine army's official banner still bore the Latin abbreviation SPQR, a relic from a senate that no longer existed. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines. They were Romans. And when the West finally revived itself under Charlemagne in 800 CE, crowning a new emperor of the Romans, the outrage in Constantinople was real. There could be only one Rome, and in their eyes, it was east of the Bosphorus. And so Rome never fell. It transformed. The empire split in two, but only one half had the power to forget. The other would remember for 1,000 years. From monasteries to manuscript preservation, from Justinian's Code to the Crusades, we'll trace how the division of Rome was not an end, but a blueprint for everything that followed. By the 9th century, Rome was no longer a place. It was a claim, a memory, a crown. But how do you divide a ghost? By the turn of the first millennium, what once was one Rome had produced two entirely different systems of power. In the West, what survived was not an empire, but a feudal patchwork of vassals and warlords, where loyalty flowed through swords and kinship, not legislation. Land meant legitimacy. Documents, if they existed, were penned by monks and sealed by lords who could barely enforce their own charters. In the East, however, the Roman state was reinventing itself on paper. The Basilica, a comprehensive codification of Roman law in Greek under Basil I and Leo VI, replaced Justinian's Latin Corpus Juris Civilis with updated interpretations. This wasn't just translation, it was transformation. Eastern Rome became the world's first multi-century meritocratic paperwork empire, governed by hierarchies of officials whose power lay not in bloodlines, but in stamped documents and strategic marriages. The Byzantine position of Epitundesion, receiver of petitions, was invented to track popular appeals to the emperor, an early form of public administrative review. It turned governance into a system of state accountability rarely matched until modern bureaucracies. But division doesn't stop at the palace. It echoes in cathedrals and council halls. While the Holy Roman Empire claimed Caesar's robes and name, it bore little resemblance in structure. Its decentralized patchwork of duchies and principalities was imperial in theory, but tribal in practice. Still, its symbolism mattered. Charlemagne's sword was sharper because he claimed Roman authority. So did Otto the Great. So did Napoleon. But three Romes emerged from one. Papal Rome, who turned Peter's keys into imperial scepters. A Byzantine Constantinople, who wielded Constantine's crown in the name of orthodoxy. And a third claimant would rise in the east. Moscow, which by the 15th century began calling itself the Third Rome. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Ivan III of Moscow married Sophia Palaeologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor. With her came imperial insignia and a potent idea, that Moscow was now the true heir of Rome. Meanwhile, the Arab world preserved, translated, and elaborated on the scientific and philosophical legacies of Rome and Greece. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, Roman geography met Persian mathematics and Indian numerals, an intellectual continuity the Latin West could not replicate until centuries later. But memory doesn't just shape the future, it rewrites the past. For the Latin West, Rome became sacred. Not the Rome of marble forums, but the Rome of catacombs and martyrs. It became the Church's mystical city, eternal because heaven had touched its soil. Romanitas was no longer about law or legions, it was about Christ's vicar on earth. Thus the Pope became more than a bishop. He became the last emperor in a spiritual empire. In the East, Rome, was still administrative reality. Even in the 10th century, when Arab historians visited Constantinople, they called it Rum. The Byzantines issued gold coins labeled Roman Emperor, conducted diplomacy under Roman legal precedent, and taxed their citizens in the tradition of Diocletian and Theodosius. Their emperors went to war with the insignia of Constantine and Theodosius stitched into their armor. The Byzantine historian Michael Sellos, writing in the 11th century, described emperors not by divine right, but by technical competence, proof that in Constantinople, imperial legitimacy was often more pragmatic than sacred. Rome was not split in two. It became many things to many people. An empire of law, a church of saints, a shadow on every map of Europe and Asia. The unity was always a myth, but the legacy was eternal. Rome didn't vanish, it was reborn in every age. But each rebirth carried a new identity: Germanic, Papal, Byzantine, even Ottoman. Its unity remained a dream. On December 25, 800, Charlemagne rose from kneeling to receive the Roman crown, not from a senate, but from Pope Leo III, nestled in the basilica's gloom. He was hailed as Carolus Magna, yet neither Roman by birth nor emperor by inheritance. His realm was a tapestry of laws, Frankish Salic codes, borrowed Roman capitularies and local customs. The Libri Carolini, commissioned shortly after the coronation, rebuked the Byzantine iconoclasts, an early sign that East and West saw Rome in intolerably different ways. Indeed, Charlemagne's empire blended Roman-style administration with barbarian warbands. He limited the power of local counts and established the Missi Dominici, royal envoys acting as inspectors, a faint echo of the Roman vicarii, but rooted in Christian loyalty, not legal bureaucracy. This wasn't a revival of old Rome, it was a reinvention shaped by church, sword, and frontier reality. Byzantine envoys whispered disapproval. Charlemagne's shadow loomed not over Constantinople, but over a rift in Christian imperial identity. The Church would later wage wars in Rome's name, some to reunite Christendom, others to divide it. When Pope Urban II summoned knights at Clermont, he authorized a Roman cross to be raised, intended to signal Christendom's unified will, sanctioned by Peter's successors, marching to reclaim Rome's spiritual center in Holy Jerusalem. Crusade bulls spoke of restoring the empire of our Lord, as if resurrecting some medieval Roman resonance. The Latin occupation of Constantinople in 1204 shattered any notion of West-East unity. Greek-eyed Latin bishops as usurpers. Byzantine chronicler Nicetas Choniates lamented, "They desecrated the imperial relics and statues, the city laid in mourning." Yet these crusades, despite tearing apart Rome's successor capitals, ironically revived Roman culture. Italian city-states like Venice thrived from pillage and trade, and the pilgrim economy around relics, believed to date back to Roman martyrs, sparked a renewed Roman presence in the everyday life of Europe. The paradox persists: unity achieved through destruction. Words became Rome's final armor, crafted not in marble but in ink. Renaissance scholars looked back with awe as city-states rebuilt Rome not from stones, but from memory. Ephraim of Florence claimed that after recovering classical manuscripts, popes could govern not only with God's grace, but with the authority of Cicero and Tacitus. Pope Nicholas V, advised by émigrés from fading Byzantium, launched a program to restore Rome's walls, libraries, and fora, consciously recentering cultural Rome. Italian university jurists revived Justinian's codes, Corpus Juris Civilis, and taught law in Bologna, Padua, and Ferrara. But they also reshaped it. Canon lawyers rewrote doctrine to strengthen papal jurisdiction over kings. Architects like Alberti mined classical treatises to plan domes that echoed Roman geometry, not medieval timber. They weren't resurrecting empire, they were steering it. In 1467, the University of Rome issued decrees requiring doctoral theses in Roman law to be written in Latin, an attempt to re-establish Latin as ecclesiastical authority amid a rising tide of vernacular humanist works. And yet, each reinvention of Rome carried its gap, one filled by crowns, one by cults, one by councils. Rome never truly fell. Instead, it shattered into mirror images of the feudal Holy Roman Empire, crowned by the Church and grounded in Germanic structures. The military spiritual papal Rome, wielding cruciform armies and curial authority across Europe. Lebanon's Doha and Russian Moscow emerged later. But don't forget Byzantium's claim that Constantinople was still made of Rome, even after its fall in 1453, when Ottomans continued calling it Rum. Rome became a claim, prestigious yet malleable. West of the Alps, it stood for papal power and feudal tradition. East of the Bosphorus, Rome referred to walls, scrolls, and perennial empire. In every era, the dream of unity lingered, through coronations, crusades, and cantados. Today, Rome resonates not just as a city but as an idea of law, authority, identity, and imperium. When modern leaders invoke Rome's legacy, they speak fragments of all these Romes at once. Unity is always a dream, but its ghost shapes our world. Rome fell into 1,000 shadows, but its light still burns. If this kind of history moves you, the forgotten truths, the fragile decisions that shaped empires, then you're one of us. This channel isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are through what we've lost, what we've inherited, and what still echoes today. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Because some stories deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered together.